Good afternoon, everyone. I'm City Councilor Lydia Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Operations. It is Wednesday, August 11th, 2021, and we're here today for a virtual working session on Docket 0654, Ordinance amending the CBC Chapter 8-13, ensuring equitable regulation of the cannabis industry in the City of Boston. And Docket 0655, an order regarding a text amendment to the Boston zoning code with respect to marijuana establishments. It's referred to the committee on May 12th. The committee held a hearing on these matters on July 6th. Councilor Flaherty and myself are the sponsors of both dockets. In accordance with Chapter 20 of the Act of 2021, we are modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law, which allows for the City Council to carry out its responsibilities while adhering to public accommodations. Public may watch this working session via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv and live on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 964. It will be rebroadcasted at a later date. Written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made part of the record and available to all councilors. This working session is also being recorded. Quickly summarizing the dockets. I'm actually I'll talk about them in the order that we're gonna discuss them. We'll first work with the text amendment for the zoning, and then we're gonna go into the ordinance. The text amendment is Docket 0655, and it proposes to make cannabis establishments an allowed use and prohibits cannabis establishments. It continues the forbidding of cannabis establishments in residential districts. And the allowable use would be in commercial districts or commercially zoned properties. It would remove the ZBA from the process entirely, and specifically with regards to the half-mile buffer, which would be transferred over to the BCB, Boston Cannabis Board, to enforce. What would stay is the 500-foot buffer for all cannabis establishments. That is by state law. What would stay is the, again, it will continue to be a forbidden use in residential districts. What will change and needs to change to be consistent with state law is the way in which we measure the distance, which has changed at the state level in terms of measuring what is from the door area to the door area. And that was a change that happened in state law. And so our city law should be consistent. Again, when it comes to commercially zoned properties, it would be just like any other vice, alcohol, smoke shop, so on and so forth, and it would be an allowable use. So 0654 then fills in that gap or fills in that analysis. The proposal codifies the half-mile buffer zone. Let me repeat that. It is actually codifying the half-mile buffer zone. So we are putting it in the law. And it maintains that objective that no area of the city will have an over-concentration of cannabis businesses. That is the goal. That is the reason why we had the half-mile buffer, and that is going to be continued to be the mission. The other things that it also works on is it adds within the equity section, qualifying populations to be an equity applicant if they meet several of the criteria. We add in indigenous populations. We add in veterans as well to be considered. We also do certain carve-outs for the one-to-one to making sure that it's dispensary analysis with dispensary analysis, or dispensary and cultivation with cultivation. And we also add in conflict of interest laws and concerns for the members of the BCB in training. So just working on the zoning ordinance itself. Finally, it does establish, per Councillor Bach's concerns and other councillors, it does establish certain standards for which to judge the half-mile buffer zone in the BCB, which we do expect it to be enforced by the BCB. And looking at that and exceptions, if there are to be any, and certain standards for those exceptions. So, okay. Now going on, I just want to give those summaries for the working session. I'll allow my colleagues to do some opening statements. I don't know if the licensing BCB members want to say anything. If not, we can go right into the documents and get to work.
You can go right to the documents and get to work. Any clarity you can give us, we welcome and we're open to.
Very well. And I just want to be...
Councilor Edwards, I'm not going to be able to stay on the meeting. I have another engagement in my district. I'm going to review and again, sorry to interrupt. I'm going to review the notes or the video later this evening. But I think my number one concern was, what would the neighborhood process be? How would residents interact with the new board, the Cannabis Board, and what that process would be like? Does this give residents more of a say or less of a say? I'm just trying to get a little bit more information on that. Again, I apologize for interrupting, but I'm going to review the notes later tonight. I might call you later tonight also, Councilor Edwards.
Very well. Councilor Bach?
I'm happy to hold comments just as we get into the conversation, Councilor Edwards.
Okay. All right then. So if you want to go ahead and pull up the zoning amendment, the text amendment, that's what we'll focus on first. And it looks like we have 2 attendees. Oh, Councilor Braden has also joined us. And
Councilor Flaherty's here.
Flaherty is also here. Councilor Flaherty?
Madam Chair, I appreciate the recap. Obviously, my main concern, as you know, is just making sure that the half-mile buffer that we went through an exhaustive process across the city, countless meetings and community organizations and what have you, just making sure that, as you referenced, no one neighborhood, no one area, no one part of our city becomes sort of the pot zone, sort of reminiscent of the old combat zone. So we wanted to make sure that it was sort of equitably and fairly dispensed and decentralized throughout the city, and making sure that it's accessible. So that half-mile buffer is there for a reason, and went to great lengths to make sure that we secured it. So if it's going to be codified and respected and not trampled like we've seen in some instances through the Zoning Board of Appeals, then I would appreciate we continue to keep focus on that. But look forward to hearing from everybody today.
Thank you. Okay, so if everyone has the zoning amendment up, right? We're good to go. Okay, and
I need access to it. I requested access, but I don't have access to it.
Christine, could you send a copy?
Thank you, Christine.
And I'm just reading an email from Brian. You wanted to listen to the conversation. Happy to speak outside the working session. So thank you, Brian, for coming to listen. We appreciate it. I'm going to now go directly to the zoning amendment. Just click it up. Again, the goal of this is to make sure that a cannabis establishment is still, again, 500 feet from a pre-existing public or private school. That stays. And that ultimately, the words, it will no longer be a conditional use in commercially zoned areas. It will still be a forbidden use in residentially zoned areas. And we changed the measuring to be consistent with how the state measures distances. Are there any questions, concerns, suggestions about this specific zoning amendment? Ultimately, yes, by doing this, we would be removing the ZBA from the process for the process of granting anything, actually, for the cannabis industry. The goal is to streamline and to make sure that one agency speaks with one voice for the city of Boston, that agency that has the expertise, that agency that is measuring safety and all the different aspects of equity. While I appreciate the ZBA has tried and does bring up equity in certain things and points, they're not qualified, they're not selected, they have no point system in front of them to discuss it. And let's be very clear, they have never discussed equity or the analysis of ownership in other projects that come before them on a regular basis. So I can point to yesterday's conversation, which was convoluted, confusing, and just, I thought, not well in good form. And I I think if anything, it demonstrated that we need one agency to speak and one agency for people to go to express their concerns and grievances. This agency is also not only tasked with the movement of this particular industry, they're also tasked with being able to respond to as the industry changes. We expect at some point there will be on-site consumption, restaurants, all different ways in which cannabis can be consumed. The BCB will be in control of that. So that's why I specifically want them to be the final voice, final study, final grantor or denier of certain licenses from the city of Boston. So I'll turn it over to Kathleen, Leslie, and Jasmine for any of your thoughts. And then I'll go around to all of the counselors. Actually, I'm so sorry, counselors. I think Counselor Flynn may have dropped, but Counselor Bach, did you have any thoughts specifically on the zoning? And then we'll go to the administration.
I mean, I think it's the interrelationship of the two documents, Counselor Edwards. Like I think, as I expressed in my letter for the last one, I agree with you strongly that we don't I think as it is, our ZBA process involves fairly haphazard consideration of a lot of things because we put these crazy agendas together and people sort of roll through it. And I think certainly we all feel the difference in sort of the amount of familiarity that the BCB gets with the applicants through their process and the more sort of like cursory familiarity that the ZBA has in this. And so I'm supportive of your efforts there. I will just say, and I know you're trying to talk about one document and the other, but I'm not sure that the language that you have in the second document we're going to look at is strong enough yet for me to feel comfortable but I get the point of striking it from the zoning so that we're enforcing it in the other ordinance. I just, I would flag, I think, to Councillor Flaherty's point that to really preserve this consideration, I think we may need to think a little bit differently about it in the other document. But
I agree. I assume people will have a stronger standard and suggested language for the half-mile buffer enforcement with the BCB. Councillor Flaherty and then Councillor Braden.
I concur, obviously, with Councillor Bach and no other questions at this point, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Braden?
I have no other questions. No, not at this point. I'm here to learn more. Thank you.
So on the proposed order to the administration, Kathleen, Leslie, Jasmine, thoughts, concerns, suggestions?
Actually, Madam Chair, it's Councillor Flaherty again. If I just may interject that there was one issue that it's what impact, if any, will the text amendment have on the zoning sub-district? That was a question I did get from some folks in the community as to how, what, if any, impacts that will this text amendment have on zoning sub-districts? Right.
And one of the examples that you had discussed was, for example, if it's a triple decker or a 3-story building, upstairs is residential, downstairs is commercial, for example, right? Or in some areas of East Boston where there's within a residential, there's a commercial core within that. I believe that's where that came up in terms of concern, Councillor Flaherty.
Yes, that's it.
Right. So we expect that the same zoning that exists at that time. So if it's commercially zoned, if the building or the storefront or that area is commercially zoned, then the impact that this would have is that it would be an as of right, like a liquor store. Basically, could a liquor store exist there? Could a smoke shop exist there? As the current zoning exists, then so could a cannabis establishment. Within the envelope of the building, of course, with other zoning and height and all those other things like that, that would still apply, obviously. But that's the impact. So it couldn't exist upstairs where it's zoned residential. It couldn't exist in other parts of residential neighborhoods where it's zoned that way. Any more than a liquor store could just prop up in a triple decker.
Got it.
Madam Chair, if I may,
Of course.
I think probably it would be worth, it's making me think that I probably need to, on a district councillor basis, just go through and think about which of the commercial districts in my neighborhoods. I think what Councillor Flaherty is getting to is ones where neighborhoods have kind of customized them already, like even across the city's commercial districts. I mean, I think about the fact that, for instance, like on Charles Street, you know, a number of years ago, there was concern about making sure that it would still have a lot of store frontages, that people would be going in and out. So like professional services are banned on the ground floor, which just has to do with not wanting it to all be real estate offices. But so I'm just thinking about, you know, the places where our communities have made an effort to customize their commercial districts and how this interacts with that. But it's a thought that's occurring to me now, so I haven't done any due diligence on it. I just wanted to kind of offer that comment.
I think it's fair. I think it also dovetails when we go into why we don't want, or why we specifically want to still be focused on not having a concentration of cannabis establishments, even if we do decide we want a commercial core. And we do want a certain commercial vibrancy, or we're trying to help revitalize an area where you want to like ease up on the zoning for commercial. We also want to make sure we still don't have a Green Mile.
Right. And I obviously represent neighborhoods, and so does Councillor Flynn, that, you know, some people who live in further neighborhoods of the city regard as commercial, but the many thousands of people we represent regard as residential. And, you know, you're of course also familiar with that kind of neighborhood. So yeah, I think that's also just something, a line we have to walk.
Fair enough.
And Madam Chair, the concern from the 2 and the 3 families that have the first floor commercial, where they were hoping that somehow would remain conditional as opposed to allowed, just given the impacts it could have on their tenancy and their quality of life. That was the ask we were getting from folks in the community, that they got the shift to the business district and the allowed use, but in those instances was the sub district where the commercial was sort of the first portion of the building, and then they have a 2, 3, 4, 6 families above, that their preference would be that somehow it remain conditional versus allowed, so that they have, and I think that was what Council Flynn might have been alluding to, they sort of have skin in the game, if you will, and they have a stake at what happens at that particular address, which impacts their housing and their quality of life. Those were the asks we were getting.
I do think that skin in the game and that analysis would still be able to happen at the BCB. Because again, every cannabis establishment has to demonstrate safety. They have to demonstrate how they're going to control traffic. They have to demonstrate all sorts of different ways in which they will have mitigating pros and cons and impacts on the community. And of course, the community would come and be able to say those very things as well. They get to say that about if there's, again, a smoke shop that comes through, if there's a liquor store that comes through. And I believe that analysis would happen at the licensing board, at the liquor licensing board. So I think what we're trying to do, I'm trying to streamline so that the analysis and the experts in the room on a particular vice are able to deal with that vice and its location, versus turn around and give it to the ZBA, who is not. I mean, we know this. Their expertise is actually prescribed by the law, and none of them are prescribed to have an expertise and analysis in anything that has to do with this particular industry. Not equity, not the safety, none of those things. So they bring it up in conversation, and I find that very frustrating. So I want all of this conversation, Councilor Flaherty. I want people to understand on record, I absolutely want this deep analysis. I don't want anyone to feel that they're being shoved out of their home because a horrible business is coming on, suddenly putting in live music. People get upset about that and they're concerned. There's so many different ways in which people feel in those, you know, both residential and commercial districts, that there's a little growing. And that analysis should still happen. I am just saying it should happen at the BCB, the Boston Cannabis Board, not at the BCB and then turn around and then the ZBA with no standards, no experts on the panel decide based off of whatever standard that they don't have in front of them to deny or approve. So just turning it over now to the administration.
10-4, I call that hocus pocus.
I'm sorry?
I said 10-4, I understand. I said when the board does that, I call that the old trick, the hocus pocus. When they make those decisions somewhat willy-nilly and just continue to trample on either local zoning or concerns of folks in the community and the direct abutters, particularly when they don't send out re-notices for deferrals. So anyways, I might have broke up. I call that the old hocus pocus move.
I learned more vocabulary from you, Councillor Flaherty, than anybody else on the City Council. So now to the administration for any thoughts on the zoning and the removal of the ZBA.
Well, I think this board has been put in place as a citing authority to determine, one, the appropriateness of a particular application, and we take that very seriously. The City Council's ordinance gives us very specific criteria, and I challenge anyone to say that we don't take that to heart. All of our evaluations are public. We all vote. We all have numbers assigned to what we vote on. I think we may be able to do a better job in elaborating on the reasons why we do move something along that does pierce the buffer zone. I try to, at the beginning of every hearing, if there is a buffer zone conflict, to explain the reasons why I think this application has met the minimum standard of heightened scrutiny. It could be something that we could, strengthen as a board with your help and with your guidance. I think what happens sometimes is we've gone through this thorough vetting process. We've had a public hearing. We've heard the pros and cons hours and hours long. We read every single letter of opposition and support. And then sometimes the ZBA is used as an opportunity for the public to have a second bite at the apple. And it's unfortunate sometimes, I think, when we've gone to these great efforts, we've looked at it through this lens, every tool we've been given. And then sometimes the ZBA decides they're going to look at things that aren't really within their purview, that should be remaining within the Boston Cannabis Board. Those are my 2 cents. I feel very confident that we have a strong board. We take our role very seriously, and we vet these applications with a fine-tooth comb. We ask the difficult questions. We take our time with every single application. And I feel like we've done a very good job.
Councilor Edwards, you're muted.
And just
Thank
to
you.
and just to the chairwoman's point, when the BCB was adopting our rules and regulations, we very specifically mirrored the variance standard for when the BCB is evaluating the appropriateness of a site within a half mile. And I think if you look at the testimony, one of the things that the chairwoman does, and this is similar to on the alcoholic beverages side, is look at the distinctions between the establishments. And that's when we're evaluating appropriateness, there's a difference between when you're looking at what they specifically are offering and what their business plan is. And I think that's something that this board takes very seriously. There's one thing to have a buffer zone where you're evaluating 2 recreational sites next to each other, which the board may find appropriate, but there's also a very significant difference when you're evaluating a recreational site next to a manufacturing site, because they're very different impacts. And I think that's something that this board has taken very consistently into consideration.
Thank you. So now we're going to move to the ordinance, which would fill in a lot of the standards for which we're analyzing the buffer zone, and analyzing sites, and analyzing, of course, who is equity, and so on and so forth. I had quickly summarized some of the changes. I think, yeah, this is Brian. So everyone have the zoning ordinance in front of them? Okay, I'm just going to walk through it, and then I will bring up my changes as we go through. So this is section 8-13.1, the purpose that is not being proposed to change unless anyone has any change proposals. Moving on to section 0.2, definitions. Does anyone have any suggested definitions or concerns? If not, we're going on to section 3, which is the equity program. I have some suggestions for that. if you look at section 8-13.3, number 4, it currently states in the full sentence, but if you read it plus number 4, an applicant shall be designated by the Boston Cannabis Board as an equity applicant if at least 51% of its ownership meets at least 3 of the following criteria. Number 4, which is a list of some of the criteria, it includes a person who is Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, or, and I'm putting in Indigenous descent. Another added quality in number 6 is a person who has been certified by the Cannabis Control Commission as an economic empowerment applicant or is a participant in the Cannabis Control Commission social equity program. There were 2 programs. I think they both may have come back. So we just figured to put in both programs here. And is a resident of Boston for at least one of the 3 last years. Number 7, I propose a number 7, which is a person who's a former member of the Armed Forces of the United States. We list then each branch who served on active duty and was discharged under conditions which were other than dishonorable. So that's what I have suggestions for number 3, or 18-13.3. Any concerns, suggestions, thoughts?
Madam Chair, are you going first to the admin or?
Oh, go ahead.
So I was wondering if, and I don't know if you or the administration could just, because I'm not knowledgeable about the social equity program, so just curious if we could get a little more context on that, just because obviously in one case we're talking about a certification and the other references participation. And so I just want to understand like what is the qualification or bar like that makes you a participant in that?
Counselor, would you like us to?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So at the state level, there's social equity and there's economic empowerment. The economic empowerment, they have very similar criteria, although the economic empowerment criteria is slightly more, it's kind of heightened, and Jasmine and I can get you the specific criteria, but EE also closed out under the law under a very specific amount of time. So at the state level, you get fast tracked in your application review if you're economic empowerment, if you're EE, and you also get fast tracked, but slightly less so if you're social equity, because it's a slightly lower kind of standards that you have to adhere to. EE under the law has been closed out. So if you didn't apply for and qualify as economic empowerment within a certain amount of time after legalization occurred, you no longer have the opportunity to be certified as EE. SE, they have been doing in cohorts, and they've actually recently reopened their social equity cohort. So the difference there is that, and again, obviously the board is not testifying in support or opposition to anything, but we have seen applicants, and this has been very confusing, who they were SE at the state and they thought that was a triggering factor for them, but it was only EE. And currently, if I were to apply to be economic empowerment, I couldn't, because that's closed out. Social equity has now reopened its cohort. And at the state level, if you qualify as either social equity or economic empowerment, you're fast tracked on both. And it also opens up other license types for you that non-social equity or economic empowerment are not able to access, such as delivery. So it's been very confusing for both the board and for our applicants in trying to distinguish between the two, but both are a certification process where if SE was included as a criteria, they would still need, just like they do on EE, to show us that certificate from the state. Got
it. That's very helpful. And it certainly seems like, yeah, we would want to be using the program that is actually still enrolling people. I guess the follow-up questions I have, it would be helpful to see what the criteria for SE is, because of course the sort of sub question I have there is there anything that's qualifying people for being SE that we should just be making one of the criteria on our side? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, there must be criteria that the state is using for this qualification. And then I think my probably sort of related question for you, Leslie and Kathleen, would just be, well, we have this section of the law open. Are there other categories that, of people who sort of, it seemed as though the intent of the law might have been to include people like them, but we're seeing them not qualify as equity applicants because because they're not there? Like, are there sort of near misses that are, I mean, obviously there are people who are missing the criteria, right? But that's the reason to have a criteria, is that a bunch of people don't make it. But I guess just whether there are any like other kind of unintended exclusions that you guys think that we should at least be discussing in this context.
Well, the one that comes to mind is the disproportionately impacted, neighborhoods. We've had a couple of examples where people, like 1 or 2 streets apart, Leslie and Jasmine can correct me, in certain neighborhoods were considered disproportionately impacted. It goes by the census data or a computer program that you put in your zip code in your street. It pops up whether or not you've been disproportionately impacted. That goes to our equity criteria, and it seems crazy in some instances that 2 streets in Mattapan, one might be disproportionately impacted and one might not be. And I think this is happening in other parts of the state too. We've heard anecdotally like Quincy, parts of Quincy, or Leslie might hear more, but this has been an issue. People who thought for sure that they would have qualified as disproportionately impacted as one of the criteria, it turns out they didn't, because we follow the specific census data or census. It's like an app or something, or it's.
Yeah, so it's this. So we follow in the ordinance, it directs us to follow when we're evaluating area of disproportionate impact, the CCC's identified areas. And so the CCC undertook an extensive study based on the census data, but obviously the census data is not necessarily collecting, or historically has not been collecting kind of the data you want to look at for something like evaluating an area of disproportionate impact for these purposes, for kind of the failed war on drugs. So the CCC in conversations with us has actually said, kind of just in casual conversations, and Jasmine, correct me if I'm wrong, but they said to us when we were talking about our equity program, we're struggling with our ADIs. Like, for example, none of Somerville is considered an area of disproportionate impact. And obviously, if you know Somerville, it's hard to argue that no area there was disproportionately impacted by the failed war on drugs. Areas in Nubian Square do not qualify. Areas in Mattapan do not qualify. So that's been a conversation with both this board and the CCC and the Office of and OED about reevaluating that, but obviously that's a longer conversation. The CCC has undertaken some studies in other areas, but they have not in Boston. So that's kind of been a continuing conversation that we've actually had. We've had applicants and actually one.
Right? May I make a suggestion? Because I've also heard about that when it would come to Charlestown, right? And dealing with, we have the single largest housing development in New England. Without a doubt, and the history of Charlestown, there was certainly impacts of the war on drugs, not necessarily this drug, but certainly all drugs at some point. So I wonder if it makes sense to have the standard of a disproportionate impacted area in here, or lives in there, and then we take the regulations that we have and define it differently. I mean, that's the power, again, of this ordinance, and the fact that our regulations can be amended, can be added to, can be defined. So it would be a huge job. I'm not saying doing it right now in this working session, but there is something to be said that when you're dealing with the law versus the zoning amendment, to be able to say, we do think this should be a category, and to add in and define what is a disproportionately impacted area. What we're not interested in doing is having people who were not personally disproportionately impacted, but happen to live near, a housing development, and then saying somehow that they were indirectly impacted by the war on drugs. Does that make sense? I don't want people to be borrowing burdens of populations by virtue of where they choose to live. At the same time, I do agree that there's a problem with how the definition is working. It is if you have literally 2 in Mattapan, one side of the street versus the other, or even in Charlestown or in other places, maybe the definition being used isn't good enough, but the concept is, and that we should define it ourselves.
And Councillor, to your point, it is not in the zoning code, so you do have that flexibility.
That's my point. Yeah.
And I guess, Councillor Edwards, the thing is that it seems as though So two things. I mean, I very strongly agree that you wouldn't want equity status to be dependent on zip code shopping, right? And I think I assume that that's part of why the original thing was set up with you needing 3 of the criteria to make it so that it would at least be harder for people to do that, right? But it seems to me like in the way it's currently written, criteria number 1, we haven't given ourselves the option to redefine anything on a regulatory basis because we've said it's as defined by the Cannabis Control Commission at the state level. So I think we've outsourced it to the state. So like if they fix it, then it's fixed, but we don't have an ability to fix that definition as it currently stands.
Do we have disproportionate impact I'm sorry, I'll check the definition.
In the ordinance.
The ordinance,
No, I'm sorry. What definition are you referring to, Councillor Bach?
I'm talking about, so at 813.3, criterion 1.
Right.
One of our 7 things is, which you aren't currently proposing any edits to, is a person who has resided in an area of disproportionate impact as defined by the Cannabis Control Commission for at least 5 of the last 10 years. So that's the CCC at the state level. So my only point is that we haven't left ourselves any space to redefine that phrase on a regulatory basis because we've said, we're going to take the state's definition, which I'm sure, again, made good sense because it was like, God, if the state is doing the census tract analysis, we don't want to take that on, except now it sounds like we're all stuck with a suboptimal designation. So
when we just take that language out.
You mean just say who has resided in an area of disproportionate impact
As defined by BCB regulations.
Yeah, I mean, we could, and then make it Kathleen and Leslie's problem. Kathleen's problem, mainly.
Don't look too excited, Kathleen.
I mean, I guess, right, with the idea being that the BCB could still say, as defined by the Cannabis Control Commission. But it could also say, I mean, I guess the question is there any fix? I know you guys are talking about it sounds like Kathleen and Leslie, but there's not like a fix that's come up, because certainly, like, off the top of my head, I'd be like, just do a penumbra, like just say like, or within, 1,000 feet of such a district, right? Like just like create some kind of like, but obviously that's off the cuff. So it sounds like you guys know you have a problem, but you haven't yet there's not like a counter proposal that's on the table.
And the ordinance actually refers in one place, it refers to the CCC's definition. I think in another place, it doesn't refer to any definition. But to Councilor, to your point, that's we don't have a fix, but we definitely agree that it's been something that's been challenging and kind of inconsistent for applicants, where you're having a Black or brown applicant who lived in Mattapan who qualifies under everything else, but they don't, where they grew up doesn't qualify, or where they live doesn't qualify as an area of disproportionate impact. That is something that we have seen play out in reality multiple times before the board.
So would you be open to that, removing the Cannabis Control Commission as defined by them, and allowing for the BCB? I mean, I actually would prefer that the BCB be writing and fulfilling and have the flexibility to fill in their regulations in as much as you can. You can go, you can't.
CCC, I guess, and expand. But I guess you're saying we could use the CCC as a starting point, and then expand that a little bit.
And
I mean, there's some. We're always, because this allows people to basically jump the line. I'm saying there's people that are, I'm not, but we scour this information to make sure that they properly meet the criteria for equity, because this is such a race to open first. So I wouldn't want, for my own sake, I wouldn't want it to be so broad that I would like some parameters of which we could think of as a board and then write into our rules and regulations, like,
Could you see language that says, as defined by the Cannabis Control Commission and the Boston Cannabis Board? So just putting it in there allows for that flexibility for you to rely on one, be guided by the other. I also wanted to address what you just said, Kathleen, which was the race to open first. And I think a lot of that has to do with the buffer zone and how it's been implemented in the ZBA. I hope by removing the ZBA that we will have the buffer zone, people will feel less like if they don't get in there first and do all these things at this level, this whatever, that they won't. I'm hoping to remove some of the tension between cannabis entities where they can coexist. They shouldn't concentrate, but they can certainly coexist. So.
And I think, Councillor, to Kathleen's point, I think if there was language that said, as amended from time to time by the BCB, but I think that is something that and Kathleen, correct me if I'm wrong, the board would want guidance from the administration and from the city council on what areas, because as you can imagine, that's going to become every neighborhood is going to have an applicant who claims that their neighborhood was an area of disproportionate impact because they want to qualify. So I think that would be something that the BCB would want to have a hearing on when evaluating how to kind of look at that, given that I think the flexibility is good, but there would definitely need to be some guidance because otherwise it just puts the BCB in a really difficult position. And that's one of the reasons that OED facilitates the equity review and certification, is to keep it separate from the regulatory authority.
And certainly, I certainly think, I don't think that you guys or the council would want to write something that ended up with it being like, oh, this definition is going to be at the BCB's discretion in a kind of case-by-case basis. That's a nightmare, right? From an equal application of law perspective, and from a, just the kind of sharp elbowed pressure that people might bring to bear. Yeah, I think it's more about, so I think whatever we do should reference the fact that it would be in BCB regulation, not sort of just up to BCB decision, which is somewhat different. Yeah. And the thing is, if we made it up to BCB regulation, you could just make the regulation for now as defined by the Cannabis Control Commission. You could do what the current law says as the reg, and then but then if you figure out a better solution, you tweak it, and you have that ability instead of coming back to the council for another amendment.
So is that maybe the way forward?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other?
Councillor Edwards, in the rest of this section, I was just going to say, personally, I'm definitely supportive of the social equity program thing and the addition of Indigenous folks and addition of veterans. The only thing on the veteran front, I mean, this is a small note. I suppose that when we're listing the branches, we should start listing Space Force. I mean, I know it sounds a little goofy, but it is, I think now, actually a codified branch of the armed forces. I think that is a thing. So I was just I know we're not dealing with it yet, but since we write law for the future, I'm just saying.
How about, but not limited to? Following armed forces, but not limited to. I'm not ready to put Space Force in an ordinance. Councillor Flaherty raised his hand, and then Councillor Braden, I don't know if you have any questions. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. The current ordinance section 8-13.4, it says Boston Cannabis Board. It just reads, the mayor shall establish a cannabis board to be in compliance with the charter. And I guess the question I have is, do we want to try to add someone that is a land use expert, someone that has land and zoning experience, given that we're going to be sort of taking it from the zoning board to put it to the cannabis board? Should be someone that has some working knowledge or experience in land use or zoning. I think that might be helpful, particularly as we're going to be defining the code and commercial, residential, et cetera. So having someone that has some experience there, I think that might add tremendous value.
Absolutely. I'm going to put a pin in that, Councillor Flaherty. We're still in section 0.3 on the equity program, but absolutely, I think that's worth consideration, land use and other roles.
Okay.
Any other points on think there was one other thing I made a suggested, edit on, and that would be the carve out. If you'll look further down after the points 1 through 8, it goes on to say the city of Boston shall maintain an equal or greater number of equity applicant licenses to licensees who do not qualify as equity applicants. I'm putting in language suggesting this ratio shall only apply to retail dispensary and cultivation licenses. So that the equity program is, dispensary to dispensary or cultivator to cultivator.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Councillor Edwards, can you clarify what that's meant to?
What it's meant to do is prevent what we've noticed. For example, the state has allowed for delivery licenses, right, to come through. The first 2 years will be equity applicants. They get priority, people of color. If those equity applicants with delivery licenses are matched with non-equity dispensary licenses, what you end up often doing is where the money is, where the deep dollars are, is in the dispensary, and you're allowing a non-equity applicant to use an equity applicant who does not have as much money, but has a delivery license to be paired together as though they're in equal standing to meet this criteria. And I don't think it's right that we make sure that the delivery force is mostly people of color and the owners are not.
And another example is the laboratory applicant we've had in the queue for almost a year. It's a non-equity laboratory applicant. We cannot put that person, they're ready to go on the agenda. We cannot right now put that application on our agenda because there is no equity laboratory applicant before us yet. So this would allow us to not subject something like a laboratory use to the 1-to-1 ratio.
And just, sorry, stupid thing, but is retail dispensary and cultivation, is that a conjunction of a single type of license?
Two different types.
Two different things. Okay. So that's what I thought. So then so do we want people to be able to match an equity retail dispensary with a non-equity cultivation license in the process?
We haven't matched license type to license type, but to the chairwoman's point, we have, so for example, the council very early on in our discussion said we don't want, when Councillor Edwards was talking about an amendment, we don't want delivery to count towards the 1-to-1 because of what the chairwoman was just saying, that concerns. We have it. So there could be 5 delivery applications, all of whom are equity on the agenda, but we wouldn't pair them with non-equity. The issue is that we have certain license types that are not common, and the example being that lab. So there's a shortage of laboratories in the state, but when we're pairing based on their application date, they haven't gotten to be paired yet with a non-equity. So that would actually take them out so we could hear them separately. But right now the board pairs 1-to-1 with the exception of delivery, not license type, but applicant to applicant to keep that, 1-to-1 or greater ratio. And this would allow some flexibility with those kind of more random license types that aren't kind of the traditional brick and mortar where people are making all their money.
Got it. Yeah, no, and I just think there's probably a slight wordsmithing you could do here, Councillor Edwards, just to sort of say it might be a question of like for retail dispensary licenses and cultivation licenses, the City of Boston will maintain an equal number of licensees of each type to licensee. I just think there's a way to word it a little bit more clearly, because I think, for instance, the licensees to licensees part, that first sentence doesn't actually establish the thing about how we're operating within categories. So this is just I don't think I disagree on the point, just I think it could be slightly more clear. You're muted, Councillor Edwards.
I see your point. The original language was the licensees to licensees.
Right.
And we added in that part we thought would clarify, but we can maybe wordsmith it so it's very clear. The 1-to-1 shall apply to the following entities, period, right? Okay.
Right.
We can do that. All right. Now on to section 8.4.
Councillor Edwards,
13. Go ahead.
Sorry, forgive me. I had forgotten that I meant to step away at 3:00 and I'm hoping to come back, but just.
Okay,
Can
go ahead.
Could
All
I
your
just,
concerns, yeah.
yeah, could I just raise quickly? I mean, I basically just feel on 13.6 and 13.8. I think that putting the distance in under location, safety, and security as sort of one of 5 things in a 20% thing, I think does subordinate the consideration about distance too much. I think just many other things could outweigh it in the BCB's consideration. And with respect to the chairwoman, and I think she does a wonderful job running the BCB, I certainly feel, although I am not a lawyer, I am a reader of law and of particularly cases. And I feel like there are many standards across the law of heightened scrutiny and strict scrutiny that I understand. And I do not think that a standard of heightened scrutiny has been established in a way that is easy for the outside observer to understand vis-a-vis the half-mile buffer in the BCB's deliberative process. And I think that it would make good sense. And I don't really want to just trust and pray that that will be established by subsequent operation. Like, I think that if we're rewriting and we're shifting this, we need to be being intentional about what that standard of heightened scrutiny is. I have certainly experienced as a counselor that it feels as though the BCB in its current operation is outsourcing the ultimate decision about whether the buffer zone should stand or be overruled to the ZBA. And I think Councillor Edwards is making a good streamlining point, but I think we have to be more specific about the way in which we expect the BCB to weigh that if it's the sole authority than we have to date. And I think that fundamentally that there is a difference of opinion, between many councillors and many BCB members about the basic value of the half-mile buffer zone. And I think that part of giving up the ZBA's rule enforcing the half-mile buffer zone, I mean, there's a compromise to be made here, and a piece of that compromise is a little bit of a shift about how the BCB thinks about the half-mile zone. So I guess, Councillor Edwards, and I'm sorry to have to hop off when we're kind of getting to this part, but just that I still agree with you about, like, we can do this, like, we can fix this. The 2 boards thing is not working, but I don't think that the language that's here in the amended draft is quite there yet. So I just wanted to sort of put that on the record.
No, that's why we proposed it. We assumed that there would be some suggestion. And I do agree. I understand your point about listening as one of any of the several categories for safety. Might it make more sense to pull it out as its own separate category? Prevention of a concentration of cannabis and its own and then having some underlying things about what that looks like. I'm open to that. I'm open to also, I'm open also to if a neighborhood is already got a certain number of pre-existing cannabis, or like your neighborhood may, the standard is even, it's heightened scrutiny. It gets higher and higher depending on how many already are pre-existing, right? If it's just 1 and you end up with 2 and that's it, that's one thing. But if it's like already 3, and again, your neighborhood is, this big, but they're all coming on this one street, we can all see that there's about to be a concentration, or there seems to be an unnecessary laziness maybe on the part of some of the people who would want to establish these businesses and look around, essentially. So I'm happy to explore higher scrutiny depending on how many pre-existing entities are there and within the half-mile. And I'm also happy to maybe carve out specifically, instead of just lumping it into health and safety as one of the categories, that it's a prevention of concentration, and we call that out because that was the mission and goal to begin with.
Yeah, I think both of those, from my perspective, would be good directions to explore here. So
great. Okay.
In my opinion, from someone who has been sitting through every single hearing and who is the one who has to actually come up with the scores, I have always felt that location should be its own category. I don't think location, safety, and security go together. What we see is people just submit their security plans. I hired where security, so they get a full score. I think location, there's a lot to be looked at, and I respect your opinion, Counselor. There's a lot that goes into it. The traffic the amount of foot traffic, again, the type of neighborhood. I think location could really be its own category. And I think what that would be the distance from other retail establishments. I think we feel hamstrung by number 4. I don't think location necessarily goes with on-site security personnel and how you're protecting youth from the product.
Great, thank you. And Madam Chair, I'm sorry that I'll have to jump off, but I will try to be back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Bach. I think you provided a wonderful perspective, especially for those of us who have downtown neighborhoods. Thank you. So there were the 2 suggestions, pulling out location, right? And then coming up with its own standards. And then the other, I just took notes in my notes, was coming up with the specific. Okay. Any other suggestions? So if we pulled out location, I would assume concentration of cannabis locations or pre-existing would be part of that. The half-mile buffer would be part of that. Of course, traffic, I think traffic's kind of addressed, but what other things would you want to see under location, Chairwoman?
Well, I think D in red is important. You know, proximity to. I feel very stuck by the changes at the CCC with schools. I think we should be able to consider. I know we can, but I think, you know, really fleshing out the location of the establishment to a school even might be 502 feet away, and would be able to put some weight to that. Okay. I just felt very lost with safety and security plan.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I also think the location issue is always a hot issue in our neighbourhood, and I think the factoring in of traffic conditions and pedestrian safety is a valid consideration in terms of the location discussion.
And I think location might be more naturally paired with parking and transportation. You might be able to weigh some of the. So this location may lack parking, but it might be right next to a transportation hub. I don't know. I feel like that's more of a natural pairing than the security plan. Because what we're getting is people getting 20% because they have like a robust, we hired this group and we have this many cameras and we're following the CCC guidelines about when deliveries have to be made. And to me, that doesn't make sense. Location to me is the impact that this establishment will have on this neighborhood at this time. I think parking and access to transportation, traffic, distance from another establishment, schools, we should be allowed to consider those things.
Madam Chair, I would also concur with the chairman. That was one of the arguments when we were dealing with the buffer in terms of creating as much predictability of process and giving communities predictability as well. And so, you know, interesting to hear the chairwoman's comments on location is, and I think that would sort of dovetail to communities and communities having a stronger sense of predictability as to what's going to happen or what's going to take place in their neighborhood or in their local business district, and having location be sort of taken out from where it is now. That actually might make tremendous sense.
If you recall, Councillor Flaherty, I think Councillor Braden may have been on as well, but we did have a hearing specifically about locating a dispensary near a methadone and clinic and other services for folks in recovery. And it was a good hearing. Actually, the folks who came and spoke, Jack Kelly and Katie O'Leary, both were open about their own recovery, but also about what they felt would have been an impact on them if they had to pass by a dispensary. And it wasn't like it was unified, but I'm curious what the board's thoughts are about that as well. Proximity to.
I think to me, that is very important. Yeah. And I felt like the criteria we have doesn't let us take into consideration those things subjectively or objectively. We're stuck with things like, you know, every brown bag is coded, you know, it's like, okay, you met the minimum requirements, but I think location is really what the neighborhoods care about.
Agreed.
The other question I have, and I don't know if this is the right place in the conversation, if there are several dispensaries in the line to come up for approval, and one gets approval, and then it gets thrown out with a ZBA. So it was the first one out of the box, and it gets thrown out with a ZBA, even though it's been approved by you folks. And then later, another dispensary comes along that if the first one was approved and fully operational, the second one would have fallen within the buffer zone. These are the conundrums I'm sure you folks have to deal with every day, but I don't envy you your job. How do you handle that situation? Like, can you look back historically about what was approved and maybe thrown out by the ZBA, and then consider another application by another group in the context of that environment?
Under the BCB's regulations, an existing establishment is someone with an HCA prior to the board being created, or following the creation of the board, an entity that was granted a license and has executed an HCA. So in terms of how the board, the BCB, looks at the buffer zone, even if it's being, out of the 5 that have been granted by the board and denied by the ZBA, 1 has withdrawn, 4, I believe, are litigating. So when the BCB applies that, they don't look to the ZBA decision, they look to what this sitting board granted.
So in our eyes, those 3 of the 4 are still valid, or they're still alive in our eyes. They would still create the buffer zone.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was wondering about. Thank you.
And sometimes these ZBA hearings, we don't know, they've been moving along pretty steadily, but there could be something that still they could get through the ZBA and still decide not to open for whatever reason. So we wait until the HCA is either we're informed they've withdrawn or it's no longer valid.
Okay. That's all I have for now, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So just keeping in mind what Councillor Bach had said, and we'll get to these sections again a second time, I did want to move on to 13.4, which is the mayor shall establish a cannabis board. We suggested edits from my office where this for conflict of interest and ethics training, where we say no member of the cannabis board may be a close associate, controlling person, or investor in a business that holds, is seeking, or intends to seek a license from the board. The board members shall receive annual ethics training and shall provide a financial disclosure statement on an annual basis to ensure compliance with the above conflict of interest provisions. I believe also Councillor Flaherty wanted to include the board would also have a land use expert. But let's start,
That's correct,
with the conflict of interest.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Yes, I just thought it would add value if we have someone that has some land use or zoning experience, given that they'll have to interpret, text amendments and zoning and plans, etc.
I think was it essentially to codify the seats on the zoning on the BCB? Because I thought we already had. Did we have a labor requirement and all these different perspectives, or?
Yeah, I believe so. There was different areas of expertise or specialties, whatever. But I know that there was no mention of anyone with any sort of land use or zoning.
We have licensing, public safety, public health, labor, community organizing. We really, I'm just confused when we would be analyzing the zoning. If it's residential, it goes to ZBA. If it's not residential, we move forward with it. So we're not really analyzing the zoning.
Or the buffer zone.
Well, all we're doing is determining whether or not it's a half mile between another existing HCA or establishment. We require a certified engineer to give us that information.
Sub-districts.
Some districts is a different story, but I thought we were as we would with liquor licensing, and that might come into the location. If we beefed up the location category, we could take those things into consideration.
Two things. So we'll check on I think the expertise you're looking for, Councillor Flaherty, might be in the person with licensure and the ability to analyze. And we just had a really good, robust conversation and continue to have a robust conversation about how to analyze that buffer zone and creating very strict standards for looking at it. Moving a little bit on in this conversation, I see Brian has his hand raised. I will get to you, Brian, shortly, but was there any concerns, questions, suggestions for the conflicts of interest, the financial disclosures of board members, ethics training at all? Okay, I just want to make sure that's a suggested edit, and that I think it makes sense. I think the other board members actually have a new executive order that requires them to do that as well, the ZBA. So this is being consistent. Okay. Brian, you had raised your hand.
I had. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Thank you for letting me listen in to the conversation. If I could take a minute or two just to reflect on a few of the things that I heard today.
Yes.
Okay. So several of you had talked a bit about, alcohol or liquor stores as sort of the model. And if a liquor store could go somewhere, then shouldn't a cannabis dispensary? And I agree with you. The issue with, at least where I am, is that a liquor store isn't, as of right, allowed in the place where the applicant had proposed. And for a variety of other reasons, traffic, quality of life, pedestrian safety, we opposed it. We would prefer to see things go for retail cannabis into districts that are zoned for retail. And so it would seem like the match is there. And so this discussion today, even Ms. Joyce had just mentioned, we aren't really analyzing the zoning, but that seems to be the great concern, that if a licensing board is, because the zoning would change to allow retail cannabis everywhere but residential, right? You wouldn't have to look at zoning and the impacts on the community in any other district, or in any district really. So that seems to be a significant concern. I'm raising it, but I would think if other people heard what was just described, that you're not looking at zoning and you're just going to put them anywhere proposed because it's as of right.
No, I want to be very clear. That is not what I said or what the chairwoman said.
Okay.
Okay. We had a robust conversation, literally, where the chairwoman said location should be its own category to analyze.
Yep.
Specifically because of the impact on where it's near school, whether it's near a methadone clinic, whether it's near another establishment, whether it's within the half-mile buffer zone. Yep. So we're actually first of all, I want to be clear, we're codifying the half-mile buffer zone, which isn't even part of our laws right now, making it law, and then adding to it the analysis for how this works. Sure. And that is what I want to be clear. And I want that all to be in one house, which is why I no longer want it to be bifurcated, where that analysis is somewhat touched on by the ZBA, because the ZBA oftentimes steps into categories that they have no expertise in. They want to ask about equity. They ask about all these different questions that they have no expertise in. They have 5 minutes when they look at the application and kind of just decide off the cuff. This is a robust conversation that is established for community outreach for months in advance, outreach to the city councilor. I've been to the meetings, and I can tell you this. I mean, I have agreed and disagreed greatly with the Cannabis Board. I've watched them oppose an applicant and make them come back and be better. So this, I just want to make sure that, the description that we're saying they go anywhere, anyway, anyhow is not at all the point of this conversation. The point is the analysis happens in one city agency.
Okay, and so for that analysis, I think Councillor Flaherty's question and suggestion about having folks that have city planning experience, it's vital then that the BCB has that experience as well, because those things that we were concerned with relative to, again, the dispensary that was proposed across the street from residences, were very much about city planning, about lack of public transportation, pedestrian safety, vehicle safety, traffic, are not about equity. And in fact, that wasn't anything we looked at in how we opposed it. In fact, it's really up to, you folks. I think you're better positioned to make those determinations. So I don't think anything that we ever had given as feedback, fell into that realm. So we are in agreement there. I just think of things like, building height, like who will decide if it goes outside of current zoning for that. And right now I'm hearing the BCB would, but how, like,
these aren't being built. I'm just gonna defend my experience. I've been chair of the liquor licensing board now for almost 3 years, and I take these things to heart. We look at the public need for a particular type of license on the licensing board, whether it's a package store license, a beer and wine license, an alcohol license. A public need is not popularity. It's not support. It's not lack of opposition. It's a public need for a particular type of license in a neighborhood. So bringing that hat over to the Cannabis Board, that goes to location. If there's 3 retail cannabis establishments on a street in a neighborhood, let me guess, South Boston, there probably wouldn't be a public need for that type of license in that neighborhood. Different on Newbury Street, you might find more retail establishments on Newbury Street, just as you might find 2 liquor stores on Newbury Street, 2 t-shirt shops on Newbury Street. The public need is different in every neighborhood, and I feel like I'm qualified to determine the public need as chair of the licensing board. I don't need somebody who's talking about FAR and zoning and sub-districts. I think if we could beef up the location and put some real teeth into that, I think everyone will get what they want. Right now, we are hamstrung by the ordinance and how we score things. And transportation, security, and location, in my professional opinion, as I raised earlier today, do not go together. It does a disservice to the neighborhoods. You could have a park. You could have a community center right next to a retail establishment, but there's no way for us to take that into consideration.
And
so I choose us.
If I may.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilor.
I want to be clear. I don't disagree with having the roles defined. I mean, the roles for the ZBA are defined too by expertise, except they're defined at state level, and I find that to be more frustrating. I have no problem defining perspectives. I think that they were just simply the prior mayor kind of just picked these categories. I have no problem codifying certain categories or viewpoints that we can assure to the public will always be there. So, excuse me, if the board, 13.4, if you want to see certain things codified that are already there. So we have economic development. I believe you mentioned that, Kathleen Joyce. We have labor, we have safety, we have health, we have licensing. I don't mind writing that in there. And if land use or urban something or city planning is something else that you think makes sense, I'm happy to add that additional seat or perspective. So going forward, I think if it's just a matter of making sure certain perspectives are there, if that's all we're talking about, I'm open to it. I like the perspectives that are currently there, so I'm not trying to get rid of anything. If anything, just making sure as we go to add board members going forward, another perspective could be there. And to be very frank, it should, because we might, again, have indoor dining and we might want a restaurant perspective because we might have consumption on site. I don't mind the flexibility of having certain perspectives be guided in our ordinance. So that's all. And I do think, again, there is, and I appreciate the not just the defense, but the perspective from having been on chairs of both licensing board and dealing with vices. I think it's a valuable perspective. So I do appreciate that, Chairwoman. Brian, what do you think of that?
So I liked what Ms. Joyce said, Chairwoman Joyce said, as far as location being critically important. It is. When the zoning is changed so that everything is as of right, it just makes it difficult for the community to have any recourse to question or challenge. That's all. So So, as I said in my email, I think making retail as of right would certainly streamline things, at least for some locations. Maybe it's not all. Again, the BCB is far more attuned to all the applicants and where they've suggested or asked for approval to go. It just, again, our experience may be unique in that it was an applicant proposing to go into a local industrial subdistrict rather than retail. So again, maybe there's something in that. The other thing, and again, what this is just observational with the BCB process. One of the things that we saw with the scoring was that there was a very broad range of scores. In our case, they range from 74 to 99. And not that in and of itself is necessarily bad, because obviously people are coming with diverse points of view. But to some, it could look as though, it's a pretty wide spread, and that maybe it's a lot subjective and less objective. And so as you do this work, at least consider ways to try to guide those that are doing scoring. And the last thing I'll say about scoring is, at least based on the informational meeting from March 16th of this year, it was clear that the scoring was, I'd say optional or a guide, rather than, that there was a minimum threshold that someone had to meet in order to have one of the board members, vote to approve them.
Mr. Graves, I'm going to jump in there as the executive secretary.
Yep.
The ordinance is very clear about what the criteria for the BCB evaluating an applicant is. And I think the chairwoman's been very clear about the fact that none of us could have looked into the future and seen how this plays out, right? We are building the bike as we ride it, and we're always looking to improve. And I think the chairwoman made very good points about how this board has felt hamstrung by some of the criteria. That being said, we have been very clear that the score sheet, which is made public, which is also in the ordinance, is what guides the discussion of each member of the commission. And there is a public discussion about each application. And again, all of that is made public. Additionally, I do want to go back to just make a point about your inquiry regarding, I believe it was the height of buildings. The proposed change to the zoning code in no way impacts dimensional requirements. There is a difference between a dimensional requirement and a use requirement. And this is actually addressing the use. So dimensional requirements would, if this were adopted, remain in place. But I do take issue with the fact that you're alleging that scoring is optional, because every member of this board scores each applicant. And I believe we're addressing the South Boston case where all of those score sheets at the request of the neighbors were made public. All of this is a public record. This is not optional. Each member of this board considers each application on its merits as it is tasked with doing so pursuant to the ordinance.
Okay, optional.
So with that, Brian, normally, public comment usually doesn't go this deep back and forth with folks.
Nope.
So thank you. Thank you so much. And I do appreciate the back and forth, but we still have almost half the ordinance to still go through.
Of course. Thank you so much for letting me speak. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay. So, we were at 13.4. We did the ethics component. Point 13.4. Then we're going into, again, these are my suggested edits, but after 13.4, of course, is the 13.5 applicability. Any persons or entities seeking to operate. That's not changing. We go into then 13.6. The only suggested change I have, 13.6 is the categories, an applicant in any category of cannabis establishment shall file in a form and matter specified by the City of Boston an application for licensure as a cannabis establishment. Applicants shall be required to submit the following information. So they list 1 through 8 several aspects of information they're supposed to submit. We are suggesting number 9, which is currently not there. And that is basically, it states right now, no retail applicants that are within a half mile of another licensed retail marijuana establishment shall be scheduled for a hearing before the board until they provide the following. So this is again, if an applicant is trying to come within the half-mile buffer, they need to provide documentation of support, which may include letters of support from community members, letters of support from community organizations, letters of support from direct or indirect abutters, letters of support from elected officials and their respective representatives. BCB must at least receive 3 of them. The applicant's statement explaining in particularity why the applicant should be granted a license despite the proximity to another applicant, addressing, and in that letter, it must address the following: special circumstances or conditions that apply to the proposed location, reasons of practical difficulty and substantial hardship, explaining why the proximity to another applicant should not prevent the BCB from granting a license, and how the BCB's grant of a license would not negatively impact the surrounding neighborhood. We also added number 3, any application utilizing Boston Municipal Code or this code shall be consistent with the spirit, intent, and purpose of 13.1, which is this code, the preamble, such that public safety is secured, won't alter the essential character of the neighborhood, and ensure minimum impact on the surrounding environment. So the big amendment is adding in 9 to the application requirements if you are within a half-mile buffer.
I support that. I think that's a big improvement.
Okay. Other folks? I'll check in. I know Councillor Bach will come back. I'm sure she will have some, maybe some suggested things. But again, this is not, I want people to be clear. This is if they happen to be within the application, right? Within the half-mile of each other, we're requiring them to produce additional evidence as to why you are doing this for the board's ultimate consideration. And we just discussed several additional points for the board to consider when talking about the half-mile buffer and also talking about the location. So we're adding standards.
Can I just make a suggestion? Because I think people confuse, and this happens on the liquor side too, they confuse public need and heightened scrutiny with public support. Could we make the needed 3 letters of support secondary to number 2? I think they really need to spend some time to explain why this application, or should it be granted, won't negatively impact the neighborhood and won't have any hardships, on the neighborhood. I think that's more important than the 3 letters of support to me.
Okay, so number 1 you prefer is the statement explaining their particularity, and then number 2, documentation of support.
Yes, and when we do have these, sometimes they're like 3 or 4 sentences, and we go back to the applicant and say, we need more than this. This is not just like you have 3 community groups supporting you. This is like, why should we look beyond the buffer zone and grant you a license here? Like, what special circumstances are you bringing to the table? Or what special circumstances are in this neighborhood that we should take into consideration?
I will say this, having one of the frustrations from the ZBA is the standard of substantial hardship is often not taken seriously at that body. And I really would like to make sure that when we talk about substantial hardship, I'm happy to maybe define that, but I do not want, as part of that definition, the financial profit. Well, but that has actually been brought up at the ZBA. People saying, I can't make the numbers work unless I go higher. There have actually been their financial issues put out there, and that's a frustration. So I'm not saying that we can, but maybe to the exclusion, like your profit margins, or, that you just want to be in a certain area or downtown is not a substantial hardship, Okay. Maybe
that's really what I try to get at when I ask the questions. It's not about my customers, want me to serve beer and wine. It's that, how will this neighborhood support yet another license here?
Right. Okay. All right. So thank you for that suggestion. We will reverse it, demonstrating the priority. And also, do you think 3 is enough? I'm happy to, we can do more in terms of letters of support.
Oh, yeah, I think it's fine. I don't think that'll be difficult for someone.
All right, then 13.7. This is, I know Councilor Flynn was interested in the community outreach, and I just want to emphasize for folks, 13.7 is an entire section dedicated to community outreach and host community agreements and discussing who gets notified and when their meeting is supposed to happen and the timeline. I would say I'm really excited, actually. This was a response to oftentimes an abutters meeting happening. We didn't know when the scheduling would happen at the ZBA. This is actually saying within a certain amount of time, the community will have its voice, will have its meeting of an application. There will be no, just hanging out there or rush process. So just want to note that that's in 13.7. I have no suggested edits to it. Does anyone else? Okay. For 13.8, again, looking at the criteria, we did discuss it actually at length, but we were considering adding in the pulling out location separate and from safety and security. That would be in 13.8 number. I would make it number 4 maybe, or if you think Chairwoman, it should be higher. We have right now number 1, diversity and inclusion, employment plan. Number 2 is employment plan. Number 3 is community feedback. I was thinking making 4 location.
Sure. I would either make it above community feedback and public support. I put community feedback and public support number 3, location number 4.
Okay.
I think, I don't know how much we want to break this up, but I think like 5A and B could be part of location.
On-site, for those who are watching at home, 5A is planned for on-site security personnel, and 5B is planned for building and product security. No?
No, I would say location. I would take, I don't know what, I'm looking at number 5 as parking and transportation plan, and A is transportation, and B is accessibility and amount of on-site parking. To me, that goes more to location than it does to.
Okay. You are correct. I'm sorry. I had already adjusted for 4 and my number shifted. So agreed. And then the on-site security personnel would go under safety and security. And
Yes.
Plan for protecting youth from accessing the product would also go there. Okay.
In the delivery of product, because I think that goes to
And
safety.
delivery of product would
Yeah.
say safety and security. Okay. All right. What are the edits? I think that those were my suggested edits. To the board, is there a minimum threshold for points? Should there be?
I don't know. I think people might, I don't know.
I think having a minimum threshold puts the commissioners in an awkward situation because people are just going to feel like they could check the box on everything they need to accomplish. So I think giving each commissioner the option to kind of use that as their guide to their discussions and to their vote has been really helpful. But obviously I defer to Kathleen as the chairwoman, but I think it would be boxing in the members of the board. And I don't know that their scores would be able to be as genuine as I think they have been.
Okay, I have heard that before, actually, when points, what I have learned is oftentimes applicants will figure out how to they dive to the bottom and get as minimum as possible. Like they know if it's 51 points, they just try to cobble together to get that. So I've heard that as a criticism of having a minimum because people tend to just try to aim for that. But I'm open to it. If you guys have
I just feel like every category is different. Like some categories can be improved. So you might get a 74 because your employment plan isn't strong. So you might end up with a 74, but you're an equity applicant. So we're like going to send you to technical assistance to like help beef up the security, your employment plan. Just never wrote one before. So we see such a disparity between what comes to us sometimes, and we try to work with them, but I wouldn't want someone to try to, on either end, to try to game the system just to get like, oh, we have to get a 75. That's my opinion. I think, I personally think switching up with the suggestions we just talked about will strengthen the process.
Okay. I will say again, for most folks, this is a new board that the city council did create. I will say one of the things we are trying to get the ZBA to have is actually transparency on how they vote and analyze projects, which I believe they don't give that right now. They don't explain what they looked at, and there's no points for that, for the variances they give out. So this is actually a more transparent board and analysis on this emerging industry. So I wanted to give kind of acknowledge that. I know people might be frustrated, but with this, but it's actually more transparent than the ZBA's analysis. And I know, and I want to give compliments to Leslie specifically, in part because I will miss her, and but also just to acknowledge that I don't know an email that hasn't been sent to her, a FOIA request, everything that she hasn't responded to consistently and with I think great timing and professionalism. I've had the honor to work with with Jasmine, with Kathleen, and with Leslie on outdoor dining as well. And I just wanted to make sure people are very clear that these are some of the hardest working people. Even when I disagree with them, they have never shown anything but professionalism and wanting to do their jobs. So I want to say thank you. Thank you for coming today with your suggestions. And I believe the process will go as such. The zoning amendment itself, we will very likely bring up for a vote on Wednesday. Assuming that the language, that I can work with Councillor Bach and make sure that she's comfortable with the language suggestions that we have, we might be able to also bring up the ordinance as well. Again, for those who are watching, the ordinance is going to be a living, breathing document because the industry is living, breathing, and growing all the time. So it is not that we make mistakes. It's more like we learn and adjust and regulate as we go. Unless anybody else has any suggestions or questions, I'm going to go ahead and close out today's working session. And I've told you about the next steps. So thank you all for being here today. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.